My future mother-in-law picked up the hem of my wedding dress between two fingers, the way you might handle something you suspect has just come from a discount rack, and announced to the entire bridal shop that it looked cheap, honestly. For someone marrying into this family. Her sister agreed. Her daughter-in-law, my fiancé's brother's wife, actually laughed. I stood very still in front of that three-way mirror, in a dress I had made myself, from a pattern I had drafted myself, using techniques I had spent 11 years perfecting, and I said nothing at all for a long moment. Because the week before, that same trio of women had stood at another wedding, in another city, and spent an entire cocktail hour telling anyone who would listen that the bride's gown was, in their exact words, the most exquisite thing they'd ever seen. I had made that dress too. Nobody in that room had any idea. My name is Perpetua Achterberg, and this is the story of the year my fiancé's family decided I wasn't good enough for them, without ever once discovering that some of the most talked about women in their own social circle had been wearing my work, quietly and anonymously, for years. I fell in love with sewing the way some people fall in love with music, early and completely, sitting beside my grandmother Adeline at her ancient singer machine from the time I was 7 years old, watching her hands move fabric under the needle with a confidence I found almost mesmerizing. My grandmother had made a modest living, most of her adult life, altering and mending clothes for a small clientele in our working-class neighborhood, careful, unglamorous work that paid the bills, but never made her wealthy or well-known. I studied fashion design formally, earning a degree from a respected but not especially prestigious program, and I spent my 20s working in increasingly frustrating positions within the industry. An assistant designer role at a mid-tier bridal house that took credit for my sketches without ever crediting me publicly, a brief, disillusioning stretch at a fast fashion company that valued speed over any of the careful, considered craftsmanship I actually loved. By the time I turned 30, I had grown quietly disenchanted with the industry's more visible, credit-hungry side, and I made a decision that surprised most of my former classmates. I went independent, working entirely by referral, taking on a small, carefully selected number of bridal commissions each year, and, crucially, requiring every single client to sign a confidentiality agreement protecting my anonymity. This was not, I want to be clear, some strategic mystique I cultivated for marketing purposes. It began, honestly, out of a difficult experience early in my independent career, when a client's mother, a woman with significant social standing, had insisted that any dress I made for her daughter be attributed, in wedding announcements and social media, to a much more famous designer's atelier, one she claimed had consulted on the piece. A claim that was entirely false, but that she felt reflected better on the family's status than crediting an unknown independent seamstress. I had been young and eager for the commission at the time, and I had gone along with it, watching my own work praised under someone else's name in a glossy wedding feature, feeling a specific, hollow kind of hurt I never wanted to experience again. From that point forward, I built my entire business model around discretion. My clients came to me through careful, trusted referral, almost always other women who had worn my work themselves and wanted to send a friend my way without publicly revealing the source. I signed confidentiality agreements protecting each client's privacy about who had actually made their gown, agreements that, I eventually realized, cut both ways, protecting my own anonymity just as thoroughly as theirs. Over 11 years, I built a genuinely successful, if entirely invisible, career, dressing brides in 3 different states, women whose weddings appeared in regional society pages and occasionally national bridal magazines, always crediting some vague, unnamed custom design, never my actual name. I met Fenwick Calloway 4 years ago, at a mutual friend's dinner party, and fell for him slowly and genuinely, the way you fall for someone whose company simply feels easy in a way you didn't realize you'd been missing. Fenwick worked as an architect, thoughtful and a little reserved, and he came from a family that occupied a very different social world than the one I'd grown up in. Old money, carefully maintained connections, the kind of family that measured a person's worth partly, whether they would ever admit it plainly, by visible markers of status. I want to be fair to Fenwick himself, because he was never the source of the cruelty in this story. He loved me for exactly who I was, genuinely curious about my work, quietly proud, in his understated way, of the career I'd built entirely on my own terms. The difficulty, from nearly the beginning of our relationship, came from his mother, Wilhelmina Calloway, and by extension her sister, Rosalind, and Fenwick's older brother's wife, Delphine, three women who together formed a kind of tight, watchful trio at every family gathering, deciding collectively, it often seemed, who and what met their standards. Wilhelmina had never been openly hostile toward me, in the way that would have at least given me something concrete to push back against. Her disapproval expressed itself instead through a long accumulation of small, careful comments, questions about whether I'd ever considered a more stable career path, gentle observations about how resourceful it was that I'd managed to build a business without much formal industry recognition, the kind of backhanded remarks that leave you feeling slighted without ever being able to point to a single sentence and call it outright rude. I did not tell Wilhelmina, Rosalind, or Delphine about the true nature of my career, beyond the vague description I gave most people outside my professional circle, that I did custom sewing and alterations work, a description technically true but deliberately understated, partly out of my own long-standing habit of discretion, and partly, I'll admit honestly, because some instinct told me that revealing the actual scope and reputation of my work might not soften their judgment the way I once naively hoped it would, given how thoroughly they seemed to have already decided what kind of person I was. Fenwick proposed 18 months ago, on a quiet weekend trip that felt, refreshingly, entirely free of his family's usual careful performance, and I said yes without a single doubt. We began planning a modest wedding, deliberately smaller and more understated than the lavish affairs his extended family usually favored, a choice that I suspect disappointed Wilhelmina more than either of us fully realized at the time. I decided, early in the planning process, that I would make my own wedding dress. This was not, I want to emphasize, some grand romantic statement I intended to announce publicly. It was simply the most natural choice available to me, given that I had spent 11 years developing exactly the skills required, and given that no other designer, however talented, could have understood as intimately as I did precisely how I wanted to move and feel and be seen on my own wedding day. I drafted the pattern myself over several months, working late in the evenings after finishing commissioned work for actual paying clients, choosing a silk crepe fabric with a subtle, hand-finished bias cut that I knew, from over a decade of experience, would move with quiet elegance rather than announcing itself loudly the way more heavily embellished gowns often did. I did not tell Wilhelmina I was making the dress myself. This was, in hindsight, perhaps a mistake, though I'm not sure a different approach would have changed what eventually happened. I simply told her, when she insisted on being present for what she called the important fitting, that the dress was nearly complete and that she was welcome to see it. The fitting took place at a small, elegant bridal boutique in the city, one that occasionally hosted private events for exactly this kind of appointment, though the dress itself, of course, was entirely mine. Brought in simply for the space and the good lighting and the large three-way mirror the venue provided. Wilhelmina arrived with Rosalind and Delphine in tow, an entourage I hadn't specifically invited, but hadn't felt able to discourage either, given how thoroughly Wilhelmina had positioned herself as an essential presence in every wedding-related decision. I want to describe the dress itself honestly, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how unfounded the criticism that followed actually was. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a simple or inexpensive-looking garment. The silk crepe alone had cost more than most complete dresses at mid-range bridal retailers. The hand-finished seams, the carefully engineered bias cut that required weeks of technical adjustment to drape correctly, the subtle, almost invisible boning structure that gave the bodice its quiet architectural support without a single visible seam. Every element reflected 11 years of accumulated skill, the same skill that had, in fact, produced gowns Wilhelmina herself had previously praised, though she had no idea of that connection. I stepped out from behind the changing curtain, and I remember the specific silence that followed, the particular quality of silence that happens when someone is deciding, in real time, how to phrase something unkind in a way that still sounds reasonable. Wilhelmina circled me slowly, the way you might circle a piece of furniture you're evaluating for purchase, and then she reached down and picked up the hem between two fingers, examining the fabric with an expression I recognized, even then, as performative for her sister and daughter-in-law's benefit as much as genuine assessment. "It's sweet," she said, in the particular tone that made clear the word was not intended kindly. "A little simple, isn't it? A little cheap, honestly, for someone marrying into this family. I would have expected something with a bit more presence, given the guest list we're working with." Rosalind made a small, agreeing sound. Delphine, standing slightly behind them, actually laughed, a short, dismissive sound that landed harder, somehow, than Wilhelmina's more elaborate criticism. I stood there, in front of that three-way mirror, in a dress that represented some of the finest technical work of my entire career, and I felt something complicated rise in my chest, not quite anger yet, more a kind of stunned, painful clarity about exactly how these three women had always seen me, now finally spoken aloud instead of merely implied. I did not say anything immediately. I want to explain why, because I think the reason matters. It was not simply restraint, or politeness, or fear of confrontation. It was, honestly, a kind of professional instinct kicking in, the same instinct that had guided 11 years of careful, quiet discretion. I understood, standing there, that I was holding a piece of information these three women did not have, and some part of me, even in that raw, hurt moment, was already calculating exactly how and when that information might matter. Because here is what none of them knew, standing in that boutique, insulting a dress they had no idea was made by the same hands that had, 1 week earlier, produced a gown they had spent an entire cocktail hour praising, at a wedding they had all three attended together as guests. The bride at that previous wedding was a young woman named Marisol Kesseling, daughter of a prominent local family, marrying into an even more prominent one, a wedding that had been, by every account, one of the social highlights of the season in the circles Wilhelmina, Rosalind, and Delphine moved in. I had made Marisol's gown 8 months earlier, working closely with her through a referral from a previous client, an elaborate, deceptively simple ivory silk gown with hand-embroidered detailing along the neckline that had taken nearly 300 hours of work to complete. I knew, because Fenwick had mentioned it to me afterward, mostly in passing, that his mother and aunt and sister-in-law had attended that wedding as guests of the groom's family, and that they had spent a significant portion of the cocktail hour discussing the bride's dress in the kind of detailed, admiring language that only truly impresses people express about something they consider genuinely exceptional. Fenwick had relayed it to me almost as an amusing anecdote at the time, not realizing, since I had never told him the specific identity of most of my clients, that the dress in question was mine. I stood in that fitting room, absorbing the sting of Wilhelmina's comment, and I understood, with a strange, quiet certainty, exactly what I wanted to do with this information, though I did not act on it immediately. I let the moment pass that day with only a brief, measured response, something along the lines of, "I'm glad you have opinions about it. I made the dress myself, so I'll take that under advisement," a sentence that, at the time, none of them seemed to fully register as significant, assuming, I think, that I meant only that I had done minor alterations myself rather than understanding the full scope of what made it myself actually meant. I did not correct their assumption in that moment. I want to be honest that part of this was simple emotional self-protection. I did not have the composure, standing there freshly hurt, to launch into a full explanation of my actual career while three women who had just called my work cheap stood watching my face for a reaction. But part of it, I'll admit, was also something more deliberate. I had spent 11 years building a career on discretion, on letting the work speak for itself through careful referral rather than public credit, and some instinct told me that the most powerful response to this particular insult would not be an immediate, defensive correction, delivered in the heat of hurt feelings. It would be patience and the eventual, undeniable revelation of the actual truth, delivered on my own terms. I did not tell Fenwick immediately either, not because I intended to hide it from him permanently, but because I needed some time to sit with my own feelings before deciding how I wanted to handle it. When I finally did tell him, about a week later, sitting together in our apartment on a quiet evening, his reaction was immediate and genuinely angry on my behalf. Angrier, honestly, than I had expected. "You made Marisol Kessling's dress," he said, once I'd explained the full situation. "The one my mother wouldn't stop talking about for 2 weeks?" "Perpetua, that's—" He stopped, shaking his head slowly, something between disbelief and a kind of protective fury settling into his expression. "I need to tell them." I asked him not to, at least not yet, and I explained why, as carefully as I could. I did not want the truth to come out through Fenwick relaying it secondhand, framed as a defensive correction on my behalf, because I understood, from long experience with exactly this kind of family dynamic, that women like Wilhelmina rarely absorbed a lesson delivered that way with any real humility. What they absorbed, instead, was embarrassment, quickly followed by defensive justification, a scramble to explain away their own error rather than genuinely reckon with it. What I wanted instead, I told Fenwick, was for the truth to emerge in a way that left no room for that kind of graceful escape. I wanted them to discover it themselves, in a moment where the evidence was undeniable and immediate, rather than simply being told. The opportunity arrived roughly 6 weeks later, at an engagement celebration Wilhelmina insisted on hosting, a formal cocktail reception at a country club that brought together a significant portion of the extended Calloway family's social circle, including, as it happened, several mutual acquaintances of the Kessling family, since the two social circles overlapped considerably. I made a decision, in the weeks leading up to that party, to finally break my own long-standing habit of discretion, at least partially, in one specific and deliberate way. I reached out to Marisol Kessling herself, whom I had grown genuinely fond of during our months of work together, and asked whether she would be comfortable, at this particular event, simply mentioning openly, if the subject of her wedding dress happened to arise, that I had been the one who made it. Marisol, who had always been warmly appreciative of my work and had occasionally expressed frustration at her own family's expectation of discretion, agreed without hesitation. The moment came, as these things sometimes do, almost naturally, without any elaborate staging required. Rosalind, making conversation near the hors d'oeuvres table, mentioned to a small cluster of guests, Marisol among them, how stunning her wedding gown had been, how she'd never quite stopped thinking about the embroidery detail along the neckline, how she'd love to know which designer had made it, assuming, from its quality, that it must have come from one of the well-known bridal houses in the city. Marisol, exactly as we'd discussed, smiled and said, simply and without any dramatic emphasis, "Actually, my dress was made by Perpetua. She's wonderful, isn't she?" I watched this unfold from a short distance away, close enough to see Rosalind's expression shift through several stages in quick succession, confusion first, as she processed the name, then a dawning, uncomfortable recognition, and finally something that looked almost like genuine embarrassment, an expression I had honestly not expected to actually witness, given how thoroughly composed these women usually kept themselves in public settings. Wilhelmina, standing nearby and clearly overhearing the exchange, turned to look directly at me across the room, and I watched her own face go through a similar, if more controlled, transformation. She approached me a few minutes later, once the small crowd near the hors d'oeuvres table had dispersed, and I want to describe her expression honestly, not fully humbled, not immediately apologetic in any elaborate way, but genuinely visibly unsettled, the composure she usually wore so effortlessly noticeably harder to maintain. "Marisol's dress," she said, without any preamble. "That was really yours?" "The one from her wedding." "It was," I said, keeping my own voice level, neither triumphant nor accusatory, simply factual. "I've made gowns for a number of families you and Rosalind and Delphine know socially, actually. I've just always worked under confidentiality agreements, so the credit rarely follows the work publicly. My own wedding dress, the one you saw at the fitting a few weeks ago, was made with the exact same techniques, the exact same quality of construction, by the exact same hands." "I understand it read as simple to you." It was actually one of the more technically demanding pieces I've made in 11 years. Wilhelmina was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her working through something complicated, the discomfort of having to reconcile two versions of me that had suddenly, undeniably, become the same person. The woman she dismissed as cheap and unremarkable, and the anonymous, quietly celebrated talent behind a dress she'd praised for weeks without knowing its source. "I owe you an apology," she finally said, and I want to be fair in describing her tone, which held more genuine discomfort than I had expected. Though I don't think it was entirely free of a certain self-protective embarrassment about having been caught in an error in front of her own social circle. I judged the dress unfairly. I should have trusted my own eye instead of assuming simplicity meant lesser quality. I accepted the apology, though I told her honestly that I hoped it reflected something more than embarrassment at having praised and dismissed the same work within the span of a few weeks. "I'd rather you understood," I said, "that judging people's worth by how loudly their work announces itself was always going to be a flawed way of seeing things, whether or not it happened to catch you out publicly this particular time." She didn't have a fully satisfying response to that, and I didn't especially need one. What mattered more, in the months that followed, was the gradual, if imperfect, shift in how she actually treated me, no longer with the careful, veiled condescension of before, but with something that at least resembled genuine respect. Whatever complicated mixture of admiration and residual discomfort sat underneath it. Fenwick and I married 5 months later, in the dress I had made myself, the same one Wilhelmina had once called cheap in front of a room full of witnesses. I did not change a single detail of the design in response to her criticism, not out of stubbornness exactly, but because I had never actually doubted the dress's quality in the first place, only briefly. Doubted whether that quality would ever be recognized by people determined not to see it. Wilhelmina cried, genuinely, when I walked down the aisle, and I choose to believe, even now, that at least part of those tears reflected an honest appreciation for the dress itself, finally seen clearly, rather than simply relief at having avoided further public embarrassment. I still work quietly, mostly by referral, still requiring confidentiality from most of my clients, though I've relaxed that requirement somewhat in the years since, allowing a few clients, Marisol among them, to credit me openly if they choose to. My business has grown considerably since that engagement party, an unexpected but not unwelcome consequence of the story making its way, in the particular way these things travel, through exactly the social circles that had once dismissed me so easily. I think about that fitting room often, more than I think about the eventual vindication at the country club, if I'm honest. Because the vindication was simply the natural consequence of patience, of trusting that quality, given enough time and the right circumstances, tends to reveal itself on its own terms. The real lesson, the one I try to hold on to, is something quieter, that the people most eager to judge quality by its volume, by how loudly it announces its own worth, are very often the people least equipped to actually recognize it when it's standing quietly right in front of them. If someone dismissed your work, your worth, your quiet years of careful craft, without knowing what you'd actually built, would you have corrected them immediately, in the heat of the hurt? Or would you have done what I did, and let the truth arrive exactly when it could no longer be politely explained away?